Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Today's founder, by popular demand, is James Wilkinson. Now, James Wilkinson is an extraordinary character in the American Revolution, arguably the biggest villain of the patriotic cause, despite being a patriot, because he was, in fact, senior officer of the United States Army. But that's a long story. Let's start from the beginning. James Wilkinson was still a teenager when the Revolutionary War broke out, living in Maryland, but he signed up to fight in the Continental Army and was quickly appointed as an aide-de-camp to Nathaniel Greene. Now, this was early in the war, before Nathaniel Greene did a really great job, and things weren't going so well, so Wilkinson actually accepted an appointment to be an aide-de-camp to Benedict Arnold while they were up in Quebec, because he did fight up in Quebec. Then he gets what could be considered another promotion to Arnold's soon-to-be enemy, Horatio Gates. Wilkinson serves throughout this time pretty honorably, and in fact, once the Battle of Saratoga is won, Gates chooses Wilkinson to be the one to deliver the message of the good news to the Continental Congress, and Wilkinson does just this. He rides south to Philadelphia, says, well, first, he makes Continental Congress wait a few days while he attends to personal business, to give you an idea of who James Wilkinson was. Then he goes to the Continental Congress and he says, we won. But instead of saying, hey, Benedict Arnold was the hero of Saratoga, which was true, he said Horatio Gates was the hero of Saratoga, which was less true. Though Gates was the commanding general and he does deserve a good amount of credit, Arnold was the real hero. Now, because of Wilkinson's message, Gates becomes known as the hero of Saratoga. And James Wilkinson, well, he tells Continental Congress what a great job he did and how really the whole thing would have fallen apart if it weren't for James Wilkinson. That's why James Wilkinson is such a famous character nowadays. But this worked on the Continental Congress, and despite being just 20 years old, he was brevetted as a brigadier general. Now, a brevet promotion is an honorary title. He was not actually a brigadier general, but he was given that honorary term, and then he was quickly appointed to the Board of War. And we're going to make a long story short here. The Board of War was created to oversee the operations of the war, aka give George Washington a boss, because, well, at this point, people really weren't super happy with George Washington losing all these battles while Wilkinson was winning. Now, we're not going to get while Horatio Gates was winning them. We're not going to get too into that, but about this time, the Conway Cabal breaks out. Conway Cabal, of course, was the attempt, the very small attempt, the one attempt at the Continental Army, the one attempt of anyone to try and replace George Washington as commanding general of the Continental Army. Now, it turns out there weren't as many involved with this conspiracy as was thought at the time. It was actually just a handful of people, one of whom was James Wilkinson. And in fact, James Wilkinson wrote a letter to Lord Stirling as he was trying to recruit people to act against George Washington to replace Washington with Horatio Gates. Wilkinson wrote letters to people, and among them, most of them didn't like the idea of replacing Washington. One of them, Lord Stirling, brought a letter directly to Washington and said, hey, Wilkinson just wrote me this. Everyone cowers. Gates kind of denies his involvement and apologizes. Thomas Conway ends up getting shot in the mouth by John Cadwalader, and James Wilkinson, he ends up having to resign his position in the Continental Army, despite being still just 21 years old and having been given the honorary title of Brigadier General, because he did serve pretty valiantly until this point. Wilkinson was a fairly selfish person. He moves out to Kentucky, and while he's in Kentucky, he says, hey, we're going to try and make Kentucky a state now that I live here. Now, this was a long time running. Kentucky was pretty obviously on the mode to becoming a state, and they almost made it under the Articles of Confederation. But I'll remind you, under the Articles of Confederation, each state acted as its own independent country. So if Kentucky did become recognized as an independent state under the Articles of Confederation, it would essentially be its own nation. So to help spur diplomacy, James Wilkinson went to New Orleans, which was at the time controlled by Spain. And Wilkinson says to the Spanish, hey, maybe you guys want to help us out with becoming a state and give Kentucky the rights to trade on the Mississippi. At the time, Spain owned the rights to trade on the Mississippi. They did let the Americans trade there, but the tariffs were so extremely high, it was essentially impossible for most settlers at the time to trade there. Wilkinson comes out and says, hey, if you give Kentucky the rights to trade at a cheap price, well, we'll be your guy. I'll be your guy on the inside. And this, in the late 1780s, is when James Wilkinson was first put on the payroll of the government of Spain. He became an agent to the Spanish throne, spying on the United States. He gets the agent number Agent 13. That's his secret code name, is Agent 13. And as Agent 13, he finds some information that he sends back to New Orleans to help the Spanish government. Now, none of it's really important at first. Wilkinson really focuses his energy on trying to get Kentucky to become a state. That gets pushed aside because the Constitution is written and the ratification debates happen. Wilkinson is a big opponent of the United States Constitution. It gets ratified anyway, and then the Northwest Indian War breaks out. Now, for whatever reason, despite being hard to get along with, being forced to resign from the Continental Army, already people are whispering about his close relationship with Spain, and his ardent fight against the Constitution. He is still appointed as a lieutenant colonel in the army. He goes and fights in the Northwest Territory. He's there during St. Clair's defeat. He is there when Anthony Wayne takes over. And actually, at this point, Wilkinson is promoted to a lieutenant colonel. And Wilkinson is actually one of the highest ranking people in the fledgling army, which at this point is only about to become, for the first time, the Legion of the United States, which the Legion of the United States is the precursor to the modern U.S. Army. There was the Continental Army, and then essentially no army. Under the Armed Confederation, they kept a small force of about 100 people. Doesn't count as an army. The Legion of the United States was the first army, and the two people considered for first commander of the Legion of the United States were Anthony Wayne and James Wilkinson. And George Washington chooses Anthony Wayne, mostly because these whisperings about Wilkinson, although Washington did seem to still like Wilkinson because he was a very successful field commander. Wilkinson was very good at the military arts. That being said, when Wilkinson is named the number 2 in the Legion of the United States, which would eventually become the United States Army. And he and Wayne don't get along. To be fair, Wayne seems to try and get along with Wilkinson, but Wilkinson is real jealous, and he gives Wayne a lot of trouble. Wayne even invites him to a Christmas party, and Wilkinson just doesn't go. Even though they're, in the woods at war together, he has better things to do, which Anthony Wayne, as you might imagine, saw as a slap in the face. So Anthony Wayne says, I'm all done with this. I am going to investigate you, Wilkinson, because James Wilkinson, you certainly have a weird association with Spain that everyone gossips about. Let's find out what that is. Now, about this time, the Battle of Fallen Timbers happens, and Anthony Wayne beats the Native American combined forces in the Northwest Territory and wins the French and Indian War, which really could be considered the first war fought by the United States of America as a united nation, though it did start before the Constitution. It was certainly ended by George Washington and Anthony Wayne, and to a degree James Wilkinson. The Wilkinson sends back strong criticisms of Anthony Wayne, furthering the distaste Wayne had for him, and Wayne starts to investigate Wilkinson and may have even come across certain evidence to indicate that James Wilkinson was a spy for the Spanish. Crazy it sounded to most people at the time. In hindsight, not so crazy, actually true. Now, this story takes a weird twist because it was about that time that Anthony Wayne passes away. And no one else harbored such a grudge against Wilkinson as Wayne had. So therefore, everyone just kind of lets it go. Why do you ask? Well, because when the number 1 guy in the U.S. Army dies, then the number 2 guy in the U.S. Army, James Wilkinson, becomes the senior officer of the United States Army. And this is when James Wilkinson became the ranking number 1 person, other than the president, in charge of the United States Army. Granted, at this time, his relationship with Spain had become distant. He was away doing war stuff. Spain was changing hands between who was in charge in Louisiana. And Wilkinson spends a year and a half as the senior officer in the United States Army. This is under Washington into the Adams administration. But then when the quasi-war with France breaks out, John Adams kind of famously appoints George Washington as senior officer of the U.S. Army, with the number 2 being Alexander Hamilton, much to everyone's displeasure. But that made Wilkinson got pushed down to number 3 for a few years. Then Washington passes away, and Hamilton resigns. And then Wilkinson, right about when Thomas Jefferson becomes president, is once again senior officer of the United States Army. He would now retain the position for over 12 years, through the entirety of the Jefferson administration into the Madison administration. In fact, it was only when the War of 1812 broke out and Secretary of War Henry Dearborn was made a major general did someone officially outrank James Wilkinson. Not that he didn't participate. We'll get there. That being said, a few years into the Jefferson presidency, Thomas Jefferson makes the Louisiana Purchase. Great. So, who goes to take over Louisiana? Not just New Orleans, Louisiana, the state we have today, but all this territory. James Wilkinson, the senior officer of the U.S. Army, is appointed as the first governor of the Louisiana Territory. He actually goes to New Orleans to get the keys handed over, for lack of a better term, from the Spanish. Although what they actually do is it went from Spain to France real quick, who sold it to the Americas. So they actually take down the Spanish flag, run up a French flag, run down the French flag, and run up an American flag just to indicate what had happened during the ceremony. And Claiborne, I believe, is the name of the William C. Claiborne, I believe, is the name of the first governor of New Orleans. So they go together. He goes with Wilkinson to take over. Now, these guys end up having disagreements. Everyone who worked closely with Wilkinson ends up having a disagreement with him. He seemed like a really terrible person. On a very base level, just on like a talking to the person, seems like he'd be real tough to just hang out with. Either way, Wilkinson goes, he takes over New Orleans, and this is when, or all of Louisiana, and this is when he starts talking with the Spanish again. And now he's put back on the payroll, and seriously on the payroll. They are paying him a salary to be a spy for Spain while he is the senior officer of the United States. He's in charge of the United States Army during the Jefferson and into the Madison administrations while taking payments from Spain. Now, not a lot of people know this. No one knows this. It's a secret. That's the point of being a secret agent. But it's about this time that Aaron Burr comes around. Yeah, Aaron Burr's in the show because Aaron Burr, by 1806, had already been vice president, shot Alexander Hamilton, and went on the run. And when he goes on a run, kind of from the law, but more or less going into hiding, no one's really chasing him at this point. Burr goes down, and he wants to, what Burr says he's doing, is he is leasing some land from Spain in Texas, and he is recruiting people to go move to this land to start a new colony, essentially, because Texas was, the area of Texas he was going to was barely populated at all at the time, and he was going to start a colony there, which was called filibustering, and it wasn't necessarily uncommon, but actually filibustering generally has an overtone of bringing a militia and fighting your way in, and that was the accusation against Burr. And the one who made this first accusation, let me wrap this up. Aaron Burr goes west, he's bringing some people to Texas, he's moving to Texas, and James Wilkinson writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson, who's president, and says, hey, Aaron Burr is going to start a war. He's going to invade part of Spain, New Spain in Texas, and start his own nation. And then what he's going to do is try and recruit the western half of the United States, aka the new states, Tennessee, Kentucky, maybe Ohio, maybe Mississippi. He's going to try and get them to cede from the United States and join his new country in Texas. And everyone in Washington, D.C. just goes crazy. It is the worst news you could possibly hear. Thomas Jefferson, president, is first and foremost among them. Now, he already has a strong distrust of Aaron Burr, having worked closely with him, running for president, and then tying, and you know their history. We're not going to get into that. So Jefferson goes to the Congress, the United States Congress, and says, hey, I think we need to accuse Aaron Burr of treason. Yes, Aaron Burr was tried for treason. It was not for his duel with Hamilton. That was gentlemanly at the time. Illegal, perhaps, but not treasonous. Starting a war with Spain to try and take states from the Union and make your own little country, that is high treason. So Burr needs to be arrested and brought to Virginia for a trial. So James Wilkinson arrests him. He has someone do it, but still, he's the one, as territorial governor, who arrests Aaron Burr and sends him back. He also happens to be Thomas Jefferson's star witness in the treason trial of Aaron Burr. Too bad no one really knew James Wilkinson that well. I'll remind you, he has essentially been out west for about 20 years at this point. 25 years by the time the trial starts. They know him through letters. They don't really know his person. So when he shows up, they're like, oh, as I said, this guy's very hard to get along with. And he takes the stand as the star witness, and he says, here, I got this letter for you. And he's acting smug, and he makes everyone, no one trusts him. No, he's not a trustworthy character. He demonstrates no reason for the people in the court to trust him. And then he hands them this letter he has, proving Burr's crime. Proving Burr is not innocent, but guilty. And then they look at the letter, and they say, wait a tick. You doctored this. There's like things crossed out. Are you trying to cover your involvement in it? What's going on with this letter? To which Wilkinson kind of slithers his way out of the room, and the whole trial goes to poo, because that's it. He was the star witness. He was not a good witness, and the evidence he brought, he obviously doctored. Like, they literally in the room were like, did you cross things out? And he was like, well, blah, 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 and didn't come up with anything. And it sends the whole trial down. Aaron Burr is free to go, which, to be fair, we still don't really know what he was planning. But we know it probably wasn't as severe as Wilkinson said, because the reason Wilkinson knew all this, I should add, is because apparently Aaron Burr contacted Wilkinson, who was territorial governor of the area, to tell him what he was doing. Did he tell him he was trying to go invade Spain, or did he tell him he was just trying to settle some people in a new area? Who knows? James Wilkinson knew, and it certainly seems like he was lying. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson and the whole administration is super embarrassed by this, because Wilkinson ruined his case. And it was the first real treason trial of an important high-ranking American, and the case is ruined. For some reason, Wilkinson returns to New Orleans and continues to be senior officer of the U.S. Army. Mind you, this whole time, he's still taking payments from Spain, sending them back information from what he's learning from these people in Washington, D.C. That being said, no one at the time knows this, but he goes back, and he's there for several more years. He ends up, after the Burr trial, years later, he is still in the Army. He's there almost his entire life. As I said earlier, he gets replaced by Henry Dearborn, who technically was Secretary of War, so technically he should outrank anyone. But Wilkinson actually fights in the South for a little bit, taking pieces of Mississippi. And then he goes up to, he ends up going to the New York part of the campaign in the War of 1812, and fights pretty valiantly there, to be honest. He's part of some successful missions. As I said, he was always very good at war, so when it came to leading men, he did a good job. However, shortly after the war ends, he actually resigns in 1816, resigns his position as an officer, no longer senior, but one of the ranking officers in the United States Army, and he is appointed by President Madison as envoy to Mexico. He is the first envoy to Mexico. Now, it's called an envoy because right now Mexico is still part of Spain, but this is about when the Mexican War of Independence was breaking out. And he goes down to Mexico and hangs out for all of the War of Independence, and is the one there representing the U.S. As an envoy, not an ambassador or a consul, because those were diplomatic terms, and the United States was afraid to send an official diplomat to a place that was having a revolution. Instead, he was an envoy who was meant to talk to everyone, and whoever came out on top should go tell him what's up so he could relay it to the United States. And he's there for several years, the end of the Madison administration, all of the James Monroe administration, and into the first few years of the John Quincy Adams administration, when, at the age of 68, James Wilkinson passed away and was buried in Mexico City. So he is not even buried in the United States, which is weird. I want to say it's a shame. I want to say it's not a shame. It's weird because, as I said, he was both kind of a heroic soldier, the senior officer of the American Army for the better part of 20 years during the nation's foundation, fought in the Revolutionary War, an important leader in the War of 1812, and taking payments from Spain for 30 years to be a secret agent double-crossing the United States. So it's kind of fitting that he dies in Mexico, which at that point wasn't Spain anymore. And that is the story of James Wilkinson. I know this video is a lot longer than most of the founders I talk about, but Wilkinson's been requested for a while, and as you can see, there's quite a lot to say about James Wilkinson. It's hard to do in one breath. I'm getting all choked up here. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, definitely hit like. If you're new here, subscribe. I talk about American Revolution all week long. Most of the videos are a lot shorter than this, about 3 to 5 minutes, about a different American founder every morning. Plus, we have trivia on Fridays, do a bunch of live videos, longer form content, which in hindsight, this should be one of my longer form content videos, but it's too late for that. We're putting it out tomorrow. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.